So now that we have the basic concept of creating a state machine in Playmaker, we're going to add a little bit of functionality to this demo. In the previous demo, we had this Playmaker cube. It's got a simple state machine on it, a one-state state machine, and that state has a rotate action, which is causing this cube to rotate. In this case, it's rotating around a couple of different axes, so when I hit the play button, we can see the blue cube rotating. I'm going to toggle the play button, and we're going to modify this a bit. Now, I could kind of rework the existing state machine, but I do want to remove it completely and rebuild it so that we can review a couple of concepts and add a little bit more information along the way. There's a couple of different ways that I can remove this state machine from this game object. I could either go to the inspector, and just like any other component, I can click on the cog here and say remove component, and that would remove that state machine. I could also right click in the Playmaker editor window and choose to remove FSM component, which is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to right click. So I'm making sure I'm not right clicking on the start event or the state one. I'm going to right click just in this workspace here and choose to remove FSM component. So it's effectively like we have a default cube, other than it's been named different and has a material on it. So I'm going to recreate a state machine, and it's going to be a two-state state machine. And the state machine is going to pass functionality back and forth. And basically the function that we're looking for is that the cube will be still until we press the space bar. We press the space bar and the cube will run some kind of rotation. That's the concept I'm going for here. So I'm going to right click and choose to add a state machine. In state one, we're going to wait for some user input this time around, and then we're going to pass it to a state two, which is going to handle the rotation. So we kind of have a chicken and an egg situation here where we need two different states. And so I'm just going to right click to add another state. And so we have state one and state two. The start state flows into state one. So when we hit the play button, there's no logic on these states, but we can see that we're inside state one. We want to build some functionality that allows us to pass back and forth between state one and state two. I'll toggle the play button. I'll go back to state one. So what I want to do is I want to listen for some user input, specifically pressing the space bar. And if that condition is true, we're going to pass it over to state two. So with state one selected, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the input category. Okay, so these are listed in alphabetical order, and there's the input. And what I'm looking for is a get key down. There it is. Now, if I remember what a function is, or I know that I want to, listen for some kind of keyboard input, and I forget that it's in input, what I can do is I can go up here in the little search field here and just type in key. I know that I'm trying to reference a key, and that will give me a list of every action that references key. And in this case, we can see that in the input category, there's any key down is what I'm most interested in. I'll clear out that search. Get key down is still selected. I'll hit return, which applies get key down to state one. So I'm just going to satisfy these fields here. And the key that we're listening for is currently set to none. I'm going to click on this drop-down menu, and this is input for any standard keyboard. And there's a list of buttons here. The alpha 0 through 9 keys are the 1 through 9 keys that run at the top of the keyboard. There's also some number pad keys and the letter keys you can see here. But what I'm interested in looking for is the space. So right now we're saying that inside state one, if it gets a key down and that key is space, we want to fire off a send event. Now, the way that send events work is that these are kind of the roads or the transition events between states. And so what we need to do is we need to create a pathway from state one to state two, and we're going to do that with events. And if I click on this drop-down menu, currently we have no custom, no custom events. We have system events and network events. We're going to ignore those for now. we have no custom events. And so we're going to create a new event. These are just friendly names that help us stay organized to determine where we should go if the condition that we're working on is true. So in this case, when we press the space bar, I want to transition to state 2, which is going to have some other functionality on it. Now, I could call this rotate because that is the function that this thing will eventually perform, but it might perform more than just, if I can type rotate, it might perform more than just rotating. Okay, so naming a send event or a transition event based on the name of a simple function is not necessarily a good practice. Also, saying go to state 2 might be a little bit overly complicated. Okay, I'll say state 2, but we can do this. We can create this label that's several words long, and that would be an event that we can reference. I'm simply going to create one called next for now. When I come up with a better name, we'll see that we can change that. But we've added a next event, and now we get a little warning here inside this state window. And all it's saying is that when we press the space bar, we're looking for a send event, but the send event has not been added to the state. And the way that send events work is that we need to add any active send event and transition to the destination that we want to go to. And so I'll do that by right-clicking on state 1, choosing to add transition. Any transition events that we've created is going to show up in this list. And there's a couple of system and network events, and there's a system event called finished. And we've created a custom event, which is also going to show up in this list here. So anything that we've created is going to show up at the top of this menu. It's also going to be nested inside custom events. So we created an event called next. Now, when we add that, we end up with this next event tag underneath our state. Okay? And we're still getting this error inside Playmaker, and that's because we haven't satisfied the destination that we should go to when we press the next event. And so what we'll do is we'll click on the next tab and we'll drag. And when we do that, we get this arrow. And what we're saying is when we follow the transition, we're going to plug this into whichever state, and we could have multiple states, state 4, state 5. In this case, we want to go over to state 2. Once we satisfy that, we can see that our error goes away. So here's the basic logic. Our Playmaker cube has a state machine on it. State 1 is listening for a get key down, and that's user input. It's specifically looking for the space key, and if it gets it, it's going to fire off a send event that we've called next. We've added the next event to state 1, and then we wired it over to state 2. So the logic here, this is some testable logic. When I hit the play button, you'll see that we enter the start state of the game object. We're stuck in state 1. I'm going to make sure that my mouse has focus over the game view. Otherwise, sometimes input does not get picked up. I'm going to tap the spacebar, and when I do, watch what happens down here in the Playmaker editor window. I'm going to tap the spacebar. Playmaker in Unity actually gets that user input and says, okay, we're listening for the spacebar to get pressed, which it got. It received that input, and since that was the case, it's going to go find the next event, which we've wired over to state 2. When we press the spacebar, we can see that the green highlight advances to state 2, so we have some basic testable logic, and we can debug it. We can see that it's working the way that we want it to. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll go to state 2. We're going to go find that same transform category and use that same rotate command. I'll right click and make sure that I've added that to state 2. By the way, when we get into multiple state machines, it's easy to inadvertently click on the wrong state and say, okay, I want to add that to state 2, and just double click, and now I have a rotate on state 1, and I have a rotate on state 2. So just make sure that we're doing kind of a quick audit along the way to make sure you don't inadvertently add actions to the wrong state. If so, you can clean it up very easily. But in state 2, I'm going to rotate along the Y angle. I don't want to use a variable. I want to use a hard value. So I'm going to click this equal button until it toggles to the 0 value. And I'll type in maybe something like 25 or 30. And I'll rotate per second. So the logic here is that we're going to end up stuck in state 1 because we're only allowed that next transition if we get the user to press the spacebar. If the user does press the spacebar, we're going to transition. We're going to follow that send event or that transition event over to state 2 where we have the rotate command. So based on this logic, I can tap the spacebar and start my cube to rotate. We'll see if this works. Tap the spacebar, and now I can see my cube starts to rotate. Okay, I'll toggle the play button, and we'll modify this just a little bit. So we have state 1 listening for get key down. In state 2, we're rotating, but how about we listen for get key up and listen for the spacebar? And so in other words, if we get key up, we release the spacebar. Let's go back to state 1. So state 2, I'm going to go back to the input category, or I'm going to search for get key down or search for key. Listening for input, I'm listening for get key, not key down. This time around, I'm going to choose get key up. And while I'm here, I want to point out that get key down, we're using it one time somewhere in this active level. You can see it here. There's one instance of get key down being used. So just a little heads up display information there. I want to get key up. I have state 2 selected, and so I'll double click. I now have listening for get key up. I'm going to listen for that same spacebar. This time around, I'm going to transition. I could use the next event because this is a real simple loop state machine. And I don't need necessarily a unique send event, but I'm going to create a new event. And I'll call this simply reset. I'll right-click, add transition. So I'm right-clicking on state 2. I'll call that reset. And I'm just going to click and drag to wire my transition event back to state 1. So from state 1, we can walk through the logic and verbally debug this. When our game object comes live, that's when it runs its start transition event, which dumps us into state 1. In state 1, we're listening for the spacebar down. So the spacebar has to be depressed, has to go all the way down. And if it gets that, it's going to fire off the next send event. Next walks us over to state 2. State 2 is rotating, okay, but it's also listening for the spacebar to come back up. So we're getting key up. If it gets the spacebar up, it fires off the reset send event, which just takes us back to state 1. I'll hit the play button. Again, I need to make sure that my mouse is over the game view, the game scene tab, because otherwise if it's over here, if it's off to the side here, it might not register the input. It usually doesn't. So I'm going to hold down the space bar. I can see that my cube is rotating. When I release the space bar, it detects that I've released it, and it goes back to state 1, where it's waiting and listening for the space bar to go back down. So hold down the space bar and release. So now I have this basic trigger, this basic switch that's allowing me to press the space bar and cause this thing to rotate. So I can do that with a simple key press. Now, we'll get into a situation where we're going to have multiple states and we're kind of directing traffic with different actions and different conditions, and we're running different little logic loops or little programs. We can think of each state as kind of containing its own little program, and each state machine as its own assembly of logic, providing different kinds of functions. And so in the near future, we're going to have states that have multiple transition events that go to different states based on different conditions. For example, what if we created a state that was listening for user input, and then based on pressing the A key, moved our cube in one direction, or if we press the D key or the right or left arrow key, would move it in the opposite direction. And when we release those keys, we go back to the state where we're listening for more user input. That's going to be the basic setup for what we do during the next presentation, and we'll take a closer look at the logic and different ways to approach this kind of concept of creating logic and user input. But for now, it's okay if this kind of feels clumsy, using Playmaker and creating some interactivity, but it's important that we just kind of jump in and establish the workflow, and then we'll start to focus on some of the logic. So experiment with getting that simple rotation switch, and we'll add a little bit more complex interactivity in the next presentation. And then we'll throw in a few things that we did in our Gravity Lab project, just to make a simple game based on user input and some basics physics interaction. So have fun with it, and we'll catch up in the next presentation.